Between November 14th and 16th, 1987, 10 people were eliminated across Detroit's east side in what would become known as the Marshall family vendetta. All young adults, all members of the same street crew operating along 7 Mile Road. The method was surgical rifle shots from distance, close-range handgun executions, and one shotgun blast through a crack house door. The perpetrators weren't rival gangs or organized crime syndicates. They were 5 members of the Marshall family, a father and his 4 sons, moving through Detroit's darkness like soldiers on a mission, methodically erasing everyone connected to a single act of violence. The Detroit Police Department would later call it the most systematic family retaliation in the city's history. But the motive wasn't drugs, wasn't territory, wasn't even a dispute over money or respect in the traditional street sense. It was a brutal beating outside a convenience store on a Sunday afternoon. 8 minutes of fists and boots against a 19-year-old college student who'd done nothing except exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. And one father's unshakable belief that when the system won't protect your family, you protect them yourself, whatever the cost. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Detroit, Michigan, sprawled across 139 square miles of what had once been America's industrial crown jewel in November 1987. The population stood around 1 million, down from 1.8 million in 1950, when the auto plants ran 3 shifts a year, and the American dream felt possible even for black families migrating north. The east side, particularly the corridor along 7 Mile Road, had transformed from working-class stability into an urban war zone over 2 decades of white flight, plant closures, and economic devastation. November in Detroit meant temperatures dropping to 35 degrees at night, climbing to maybe 45 by afternoon if the sun broke through the perpetual gray clouds rolling off Lake Michigan. The air smelled like exhaust from buses grinding down Gratiot Avenue, fried fish from corner carryouts, and underneath everything, the sweet chemical stink of crack cocaine being cooked in abandoned houses that dotted every block like rotting teeth. The sound of the city was distant sirens, bass-heavy music from cars with windows down despite the cold, chain-link fences rattling in wind that cut through your coat and settled in your bones. And every few hours, gunshots, sometimes close enough to make you flinch, usually too far away to bother calling police, who wouldn't come anyway. But 1987 wasn't just another hard year in Detroit. It was the year the crack epidemic reached full saturation, when the drug that had started appearing in '84 became the dominant economic force in neighborhoods where legitimate work had disappeared. Unemployment on the east side hovered around 18% officially, closer to 30% in reality when you counted people who'd stopped looking, who'd given up, who survived on disability checks and food stamps and whatever underground economy they could access. The auto industry that had built Detroit into the 5th largest city in America had collapsed. Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors were closing plants, moving production to Mexico and Canada, automating jobs that had sustained 3 generations of families. The Dodge main plant in Hamtramck, which had employed 40,000 workers in its prime, shut down in 1980. Leaving a crater in the community that nothing filled except drugs and desperation. 7 Mile Road ran east to west across the city's midsection, a commercial strip where businesses had thrived in the 50s and 60s. By 1987, half the storefronts stood empty, windows broken or boarded with plywood spray-painted with gang tags. The other half clung to survival, family-owned carryouts with bulletproof glass at the counter, liquor stores that did 80% of their business selling fortified wine and cheap beer, corner markets where milk cost twice what it did in the suburbs, and produce was whatever hadn't rotted. Between Van Dyke Avenue on the east and Gratiot Avenue on the west, 7 Mile belonged to the streets. Police drove through in pairs, windows up, rarely stopping unless absolutely necessary. The 7th Precinct station sat 4 miles south, understaffed and overwhelmed. Response time to a shooting averaged 45 minutes. Response time to anything else averaged never. The physical landscape reflected decades of systematic abandonment. Houses built in the 1920s and 30s for auto workers, solid brick structures with front porches and small yards, now stood vacant in clusters, stripped of copper pipes and aluminum siding by scrappers, windows gaping like eye sockets, roofs collapsing under Michigan winters nobody bothered to repair. Every few blocks, the skeleton of a burned building rose against the sky, blackened brick and charred timbers marking where landlords had committed insurance arson or crack addicts had started fires, trying to stay warm. Vacant lots filled with trash, stripped cars, weeds growing through broken concrete. The trees that lined residential streets in older photos were mostly gone, cut down or dead, leaving the landscape bare and exposed. Robert James Marshall was 52 years old that November, though the lines carved into his face by factory work and war made him look closer to 60. He stood 6 feet 3 inches, still carrying 240 pounds of muscle and bulk, despite years away from physical labor. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen from old breaks that had healed crooked, palms cross-hatched with scars from assembly line. Work at the Chrysler plant, where he'd spent 26 years before being laid off in 1982 when the company cut third shift and eliminated 3,000 jobs. A jagged scar ran from his left ear down his neck, disappearing under his collar. A souvenir from Vietnam, where he'd served with the 1st Infantry Division in 1968 and 69, coming home with a Purple Heart and nightmares that still woke him some mornings, drenched in sweat. Every morning, Robert woke at 5 o'clock in the house his grandfather had bought in 1945 on Mack Avenue, 3 blocks south of 7 Mile. He'd make coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin, the same one his mother had used when he was a boy. He'd sit at the kitchen table, the same table where 3 generations of Marshalls had eaten breakfast, and read the Detroit Free Press, paying particular attention to the obituaries where he saw names he recognized with increasing frequency. Men his age or younger, dying from violence or crack or despair in a city that had once promised them everything. He'd smoke 2 Pall Mall cigarettes, unfiltered, and drink his coffee black while the radiator clanked and hissed, fighting against November cold that seeped through walls that needed insulation they couldn't afford. He'd married Dorothy Louise Henderson in 1958, right after he finished his apprenticeship at Chrysler. They'd had 4 sons, James was 31 now, married with 2 children, working at an auto parts store on Graciote. Michael was 28, a mechanic at an independent garage, divorced, angry at the world. Anthony was 25, smart enough for college but no money to go, hustling between odd jobs and street connections. Vincent was 19, still living at home, trying to stay in school at Wayne County Community College, studying business administration with dreams of escaping Detroit's gravity. Dorothy was 50, her face worn smooth by worry like river stones polished by decades of current, her hands still strong from cleaning houses in Grosse Pointe, where white families paid her $8 an hour to scrub floors in homes worth more than every house on her block combined. What Robert valued most wasn't money, though God knew they needed it with his disability check, barely covering the mortgage and utilities. What he valued was legacy, the idea that the Marshall family had survived everything Detroit threw at them. His grandfather had come north from Alabama in 1943, during the Great Migration, answering the call for workers in the war plants, fighting white mobs during the riot. Robert's great-grandfather had been born into slavery in Alabama in 1858, had lived through Reconstruction and Jim Crow, had taught his children that survival meant keeping your head down, working hard, and never giving white folks a reason to notice you. But his grandfather, Elijah Marshall, had believed something different. When he stepped off the train in Detroit in April 1943, he believed that the North offered possibility, that factory work meant dignity, that his children could have futures beyond sharecropping and servitude. Elijah had worked at the Ford River Rouge plant, the largest integrated factory in the world. 3,000 acres of machinery and assembly lines where raw materials went in one end and finished cars came out the other. He'd saved every dollar he could, living in a boarding house with 7 other men, sending money home to Alabama for his wife and 2 children. By 1945, he'd saved enough to bring his family north and buy the house on Mack Avenue for $3,200, a 2-story brick structure with 3 bedrooms, a front porch, and a small yard where his wife planted tomatoes and collard greens. That house represented everything the Marshall family had achieved. It survived the 1943 race riot, when white mobs attacked black neighborhoods, leaving 34 dead. It survived the 1967 rebellion, when 43 people died and entire blocks burned, when National Guard tanks rolled down Mack Avenue and soldiers with rifles stood on street corners. It survived white flight in the 70s, when every family that could afford to leave did, when property values collapsed and insurance companies redlined the entire East Side. By 1987, the Marshall House stood like a fortress in a war zone, the only occupied home on a block where 4 houses were abandoned and 2 were burned out shells. Robert's father, Samuel Marshall, had passed down a code that came from the South but adapted to Detroit's realities. Protect your own. Never let anyone disrespect your family without consequences. Stand up when standing up meant something. The code wasn't about violence for its own sake. It was about survival in a world that didn't value black lives, about creating your own justice when legal justice was a fantasy, about maintaining dignity when everything else was being stripped away. Samuel had taught Robert that a man who wouldn't defend his family wasn't a man at all, that some things mattered more than law, more than safety, more than your own life. Robert had tried to pass the same code to his sons. though the world they were growing up in was harder than the one he'd known. In the 50s and 60s, when Robert was young, there were jobs. Hard jobs, dangerous jobs, racist jobs where black workers got the worst assignments and white supervisors looked for reasons to fire you, but jobs nonetheless. A man could work at a plant, join the union, make enough to support a family. By the 1980s, those jobs were gone. His sons faced a choice between minimum wage, service work that wouldn't cover rent, or the street economy that offered quick money and quick death. James Robert Marshall, 31 years old, had followed the path his father wanted. He'd graduated from Osborne High School in 1974, married his girlfriend LaShonda in 76, took a job at AutoZone on Gratiot Avenue, selling parts to mechanics and weekend warriors, trying to keep decade-old cars running. He made $9.50 an hour, had 2 daughters aged 7 and 5, lived in a rental house on Bedford Street that needed a new roof, and had lead paint peeling in the kitchen. James was level-headed, responsible, the son Robert trusted to think before acting. He stood 6 feet tall, had his father's build starting to run to weight around the middle, wore wire-rimmed glasses that made him look older than his years. He coached youth basketball at the recreation center, went to church most Sundays with LaShonda and the girls, believed that hard work and clean living would eventually pay off, even though the evidence suggested otherwise. Michael Anthony Marshall, 28 years old, was fire where James was water. He dropped out of high school in 11th grade, gotten his GED in the Army, served 4 years as a mechanic at Fort Hood in Texas, come home in '83, and found that military training meant nothing in a city with no jobs. He was talented with engines, could diagnose problems by sound, rebuild transmissions blindfolded. He worked at Joe's Garage on Harper Avenue, making $7 an hour under the table. No benefits, no security. His marriage to Denise had lasted 3 years before she left, taking their son to live with her mother in Southfield. Michael was angry, had been angry since high school when he watched his father get laid off and turn gray within a year. He stood 6 feet 1, weighed 210 pounds of muscle, had his mother's dark eyes and his father's temper. He kept a .38 revolver in his car, had been arrested twice for assault. Charges dropped both times when witnesses disappeared. Anthony Malik Marshall, 25 years old, was the smartest of the 4 brothers and the most dangerous because his intelligence had no legitimate outlet. He'd been honor roll at Osborne, had scored high enough on the SAT to get into Wayne State University, but there was no money for tuition, and financial aid didn't cover books, housing, transportation. He'd lasted 1 semester before dropping out, owing $3,000 he'd never be able to repay. Anthony was 6 feet even, 170 pounds, wore his hair in a short fade, had a smile that made people trust him and eyes that calculated angles constantly. He worked odd jobs, a week here, loading trucks, a month there as a security guard. But his real expertise was knowing people, knowing streets, knowing who moved what where. He wasn't in a gang, but he knew everyone who was. Vincent Lee Marshall, 19 years old, was the baby, the one his mother still called her sweet boy, the one Robert believed might actually make it out. The 7 Mile crew wasn't a gang in the traditional sense, not like the Young Boys Incorporated that had dominated Detroit's heroin trade in the 70s, or the Chambers brothers who would build a crack empire by the early 90s. The crew was a loose affiliation of young men, mostly aged 17 to 24, who'd grown up in the blocks between Van Dyke and Gratiot along 7 Mile Road. They had no formal hierarchy, no colors or hand signs that meant anything beyond their immediate 6-block territory, no connection to larger organizations like the Bloods or Crips that were spreading from Los Angeles to cities across America. They were just friends, cousins, guys who'd known each other since elementary school, who'd watched their fathers lose jobs and their mothers work 2 shifts and their older brothers go to prison or graves, who'd decided that the only economy available to them was the one that involved small plastic vials and street corners and violence. DeAndre Marcus Williams was 23 years old that November, the closest thing the crew had to a leader, though nobody had elected him or crowned him. He'd earned the position through a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that made people defer to his judgment. DeAndre stood 5 feet 11 inches, weighed 190 pounds, kept his hair cut close, dressed in Fila tracksuits and Adidas sneakers that cost more than most people on 7 Mile made in a month. He dropped out of Osborne High School in 10th grade, not because he was stupid, but because school offered nothing he needed. He could read at college level, could calculate profit margins and distribution networks in his head, understood supply and demand better than most business majors. What he couldn't do was see a future that didn't involve the streets. His father had left when he was 6. His mother worked at Detroit Receiving Hospital as a nurse's aide, 50 hours a week for $6 an hour. Came home exhausted, never had energy left for her 3 children. DeAndre had started selling weed at 14, graduated to crack at 16. By 23 was moving enough product to clear $2,000 a week. The crew's core membership included Marcus Jerome Turner, 21 years old, who'd been DeAndre's best friend since 3rd grade. Marcus was the enforcer, 6'2", 220 pounds of muscle built from pumping iron in his grandmother's basement and fighting since he was old enough to make a fist. He'd been arrested 7 times, convicted twice, served 8 months in Wayne County Jail for assault with intent. Tyrone Anthony Webb, 20 years old, handled street-level distribution, managing the younger kids who actually stood on corners holding product. Kevin Lamar Price, 22 years old, ran collections, making sure everyone who owed paid using whatever persuasion necessary. Then there were the others, 8 or 9 young men who orbited the core, who were part of the crew but not essential, who could be replaced if they got arrested or killed, which happened regularly enough that DeAndre had stopped learning their names until they'd been around 6 months. The crew's territory was simple. 7 Mile Road from Van Dyke east to Gratiot, focusing on 4 specific corners where traffic was heavy and police presence was minimal. Sunday, November 8th, 1987, 4:15 in the afternoon. Vincent Marshall walked into the Quick Stop Market on 7 Mile Road, 3 blocks from his house, needing snacks before settling in for an evening of studying. He had an accounting exam on Tuesday, a subject he found both boring and essential if he wanted to finish his associate's degree, and maybe transfer to a 4-year school. Maybe get an actual career in business or finance. Maybe escape the gravity of Detroit's East Side that pulled everyone down eventually. The Quick Stop was a bunker, bulletproof glass separating customers from the counter, bars on the windows, a buzzer system to get in and out. Vincent had been coming here since he was a kid, buying candy with coins his grandmother gave him. The owner, Mr. Kim, a Korean immigrant who'd bought the place in '82, knew every regular by name. Vincent grabbed a bag of Doritos and a Sprite from the cooler, was heading to the counter, when he bumped into someone coming around the end of the aisle. Not hard, just a brush of shoulders in a narrow space, the kind of minor contact that happens a dozen times a day in any city. Vincent immediately stepped back, raising his hands in apology. "My bad, man. Didn't see you there." The person he'd bumped was Marcus Turner, who was at the Quick Stop with Tyrone Webb and Kevin Price, not buying anything, just establishing presence, making sure Mr. Kim knew who ran the block. Marcus was 6'2", Vincent was 5'9". Marcus was wearing a black leather jacket, gold chains, Timberland boots. Vincent was wearing a Detroit Pistons sweatshirt and jeans and sneakers that had seen better days. Marcus looked at Vincent the way you'd look at an insect that had the audacity to touch you. "You just put your hands on me?" Marcus said, his voice loud enough that everyone in the store stopped what they were doing. Vincent felt his stomach drop, recognizing the tone, understanding immediately that this was going to be bad regardless of what he said. "I apologize, man. It was an accident. I wasn't looking where I was going." He kept his voice calm, non-threatening, everything his father had taught him about de-escalating situations when you were outnumbered and outsized. "You wasn't looking?" Marcus stepped closer, now inches from Vincent's face. "You disrespecting me in front of my boys?" Tyrone and Kevin moved to flank Marcus, forming a wall. Other customers edged toward the door. Mr. Kim watched from behind his bulletproof glass, not moving to help, not calling police, knowing that intervention meant his store would be targeted, his windows broken, his life made impossible. "I'm not disrespecting anyone," Vincent said, his heart pounding now, his mind calculating exits. "I just came in to buy chips. I'll just go. It's all good." He tried to move around Marcus toward the door, but Kevin stepped in front of him, blocking the path. "Nah, you don't just leave after bumping into someone and acting like it's nothing," Kevin said. Marcus grabbed Vincent's sweatshirt at the collar, pulling him forward. "You college boy? You think you better than us?" Vincent didn't answer. Michael Marshall was driving east on 7 Mile at 4:42 in the afternoon, heading home from Joe's garage where he'd spent the day replacing a transmission on a Buick LeSabre. He was tired, covered in grease despite washing his hands 3 times, thinking about stopping for beer before going back to his apartment. He almost drove past the Quick Stop without noticing. But something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A crowd on the sidewalk, maybe 15 or 20 people forming a circle, the way crowds form around street fights or accidents. He slowed, looked closer, and felt his heart stop. In the center of the circle, 3 men were beating someone on the ground. The person on the ground was wearing a Detroit Pistons sweatshirt, the blue and red colors visible even from the street. Michael knew that sweatshirt. He'd given it to Vincent for his birthday last year. Michael pulled his Chevy Blazer to the curb, not bothering to park properly, just stopping in the middle of the road. He jumped out, not thinking, running toward the circle. People saw him coming and scattered. The three men kicking Vincent looked up, saw Michael's size and the fury on his face, and ran. Not toward 7 Mile, where Michael could have chased them, but into the alley behind the quick stop, disappearing into the warren of backyards and vacant houses where they knew every fence and shortcut. Michael dropped to his knees beside Vincent, who was unconscious, face swollen and bloody, breathing in shallow gasps that rattled in his chest. Blood was pooling under his head from where it had hit concrete. His left eye was swollen shut, his nose clearly broken, his mouth bleeding. Michael checked for a pulse, found one, weak, but there. He looked around at the crowd that had returned now that the immediate violence was over. "Somebody call a fucking ambulance." Nobody moved. Everyone had seen what happened, but nobody would be a witness. Michael pulled his own body up, ran back to his Blazer, grabbed his car phone, the bulky Motorola unit he'd installed last year. He dialed 911, gave the address, screamed at the operator that his brother was dying. The operator said an ambulance was on the way. Estimated arrival 12 to 15 minutes. Michael couldn't wait that long. He didn't know if Vincent had 15 minutes. He made a decision. He lifted Vincent as gently as he could, trying not to jostle his head, feeling how limp and heavy, unconscious bodies are. Vincent moaned, a sound that at least meant he was alive. Michael carried him to the Blazer, laid him across the back seat, ran around to the driver's side, and drove toward Detroit Receiving Hospital, 10 blocks west on Mack Avenue. He ran every red light, honking, flashing his brights, praying that no cop would try to pull him over, that he wouldn't hit anyone, that Vincent would still be breathing when they arrived. He called home from the car phone, his hands shaking so badly he could barely press the numbers. His mother answered on the third ring. "Mama, it's Vincent. They beat him. I'm taking him to receiving. Call Dad, call James and Anthony. Meet me there." Dorothy's voice went high and tight. "How bad?" "Real bad, Mama, real bad." He hung up before she could ask more. Detroit Receiving Hospital's emergency room on a Sunday evening was chaos. A rotating door of gunshot wounds, stabbings, overdoses, domestic assaults, all the violence that Detroit's broken systems produced on a daily basis. Michael carried Vincent through the automatic doors at 5:08 in the afternoon, screaming for help. Nurses and doctors materialized, transferring Vincent onto a gurney, wheeling him into a trauma bay. Michael tried to follow, but security stopped him, redirected him to a waiting area painted industrial green, filled with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. He sat, still covered in transmission grease and his brother's blood, and waited. Dorothy arrived at 5:23, Robert right behind her. His mother was crying silently, the kind of tears that came from depths where sound couldn't reach. His father's face was stone, expressionless, but Michael could see his hands trembling. James arrived at 5:35 with LaShonda, having left his daughters with a neighbor. Anthony showed up at 5:48, still wearing his security guard uniform from the shift he'd been working at a warehouse on the southwest side. They gathered in the waiting area, this family that had survived everything Detroit threw at them, and waited for someone to tell them if Vincent was going to live. A doctor finally emerged at 6:15, a young Indian woman with exhaustion written across her face. "Marshall family?" Robert stood. "I'm his father." The doctor's expression was carefully neutral. Your son has a fractured skull, broken ribs, internal bleeding in his abdomen. We're taking him to surgery now to relieve pressure on his brain. The next 24 hours are critical." "Is he going to die?" Dorothy asked, her voice breaking. The doctor hesitated. "We're doing everything we can." Which meant, yes, he might die, but we can't say that out loud. They took Vincent to surgery. The family moved from the emergency waiting room to the surgical waiting room on the 4th floor, a different space with the same plastic chairs and the same fluorescent lights. Hours passed. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Finally, at 9:47, the surgeon emerged, still in his scrubs, removing his surgical mask. "The surgery went well. We've relieved the pressure. He's stable for now, but he's in a coma. We won't know the extent of brain damage until he wakes up. If he wakes up." Dorothy sobbed. Robert held her. The brothers stood in a circle, not knowing what to do with their hands or their rage. At 2:17 in the morning, after Vincent had been moved to the ICU and the family had been allowed to see him for 5 minutes each, Robert Marshall gathered his 4 sons in the hospital cafeteria. The space was mostly empty, just a janitor mopping the floor and a nurse getting coffee before a night shift. Robert sat at a table in the corner, farthest from anyone who might overhear. His sons joined him, forming a circle. November 9th through 12th, 1987. 3 days that would determine whether the Marshall family remained who they were or became something else entirely. Robert Marshall spent Monday morning making phone calls from the payphone outside the ICU, calling in favors from men he'd known for decades. Vietnam buddies who'd settled in Detroit after the war. Union brothers from his Chrysler days who remembered when solidarity meant something. Street connections that Anthony had cultivated, people who knew everything happening on the East Side, who could identify faces, track movements, map patterns. By Monday afternoon, Robert had names: Marcus Jerome Turner, Tyrone Anthony Webb, Kevin Lamar Price. All 3 were confirmed members of the 7 Mile crew. All 3 had been seen at the quick stop around 4:15 on Sunday. Multiple witnesses placed them at the scene, though none would testify to police when Detective Williams from the 7th Precinct came by to take statements Monday evening. Robert also had a decision to make. The 3 men who'd beaten Vincent were the immediate targets, but they were part of a crew that operated as a unit, that watched each other's backs, that would retaliate if only 3 of them died. Robert's military training told him that half measures were worse than no measures. If you strike to eliminate the threat completely. That meant all of them. The entire leadership structure. 10 men total. DeAndre Williams, who ran the crew. The 3 who'd beaten Vincent. 6 others who were part of the inner circle, who would have watched Vincent getting beaten and done nothing, who would have laughed about it afterward. 10 human beings who would need to die for Vincent's beating to be answered. Anthony spent Monday and Tuesday conducting surveillance. He knew the streets, knew the corners where crew members worked, knew the houses where they slept, knew the patterns they followed. He documented everything in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. DeAndre's grandmother's house on Iroquois Street, where he stayed some nights. Marcus's apartment on Gracio. Tyrone's mother's place on Chalmers. The crack house on Faircourt where crew members gathered. The soul food restaurant on Van Dyke where they ate. The times they moved, the routes they drove, the people they met. By Tuesday night, Anthony had created a comprehensive map of their lives. James struggled with the plan. On Tuesday afternoon, Sitting in Robert's kitchen while Dorothy was at the hospital with Vincent, James argued for legal justice. "Dad, we file charges, we push the police, we get a lawyer." Robert looked at his eldest son with something like pity. "You think police care about another black boy beaten on 7 Mile? You think prosecutors will touch a case with no witnesses? You think a lawyer we can't afford will make a difference? So we just kill them? 10 people? We throw our lives away?" "We protect our family," Robert said, his voice flat, final. "That's what men do." Michael didn't struggle at all. On Monday night, he went to his apartment and retrieved weapons he'd acquired over the years. A Remington 700 rifle in .30-06 that he used for deer hunting up north, a Smith & Wesson .38 revolver he'd bought at a pawn shop, a Mossberg 500 12-gauge shotgun. He cleaned each weapon methodically, checked ammunition, prepared. Wednesday, November 11th, 1987, 6:30 in the evening. The Marshall family gathered at Robert and Dorothy's house on Mack Avenue for what everyone understood might be their last meal together. Dorothy had cooked despite her exhaustion from spending 3 days at Vincent's bedside, despite knowing what her husband and sons were planning, despite the voice in her head screaming that this was wrong. She made pot roast with potatoes and carrots, cornbread, collard greens, sweet potato pie. The foods her mother had taught her to make. The foods that had sustained this family through every crisis for 3 generations. The dining room table that had been built by Robert's grandfather in 1946 sat 8 people comfortably. Tonight, it held 6. Dorothy, Robert, and their 4 sons. Vincent's chair remained empty, a physical absence that hung over everything like smoke. They ate in silence for the first 15 minutes. Not the comfortable silence of family accustomed to each other's presence, but the heavy silence of people carrying knowledge too terrible to speak aloud. Finally, Dorothy set down her fork and looked at her husband. "You're really going to do this?" It wasn't a question. Robert met her eyes, the eyes he'd been looking into for 29 years through good times and times so hard they'd tested whether love could survive poverty and disappointment. "Yes." Dorothy's hands shook. "You'll go to prison, all of you, maybe for life, maybe death penalty." "I know," Robert said. "And you think Vincent would want this? You think when he wakes up, if he wakes up, he'll thank you for killing 10 people? Robert was quiet for a long moment. "I think Vincent will wake up knowing his family didn't let what happened to him stand. That we answered. That the Marshall name means something in this city, that you can't touch one of us without consequences." James spoke up, his voice strained. "Mama's right, Dad. This will destroy us. My girls will grow up with their father in prison. LaShonda will have to raise them alone. For what? Revenge?" Robert turned to his eldest son. "Not revenge. Justice. The kind that matters when legal justice is a joke. Your daughters will grow up knowing their uncle was beaten nearly to death and their family did something about it. They'll grow up knowing we're not people you can victimize without cost." Michael said nothing, just ate methodically, his face expressionless. Anthony pushed food around his plate, not eating, thinking. He'd spent the last 3 days mapping the targets, learning their patterns, understanding that what his father was proposing was possible. Difficult, but possible. 10 men eliminated over 3 nights, maybe 4. If they were smart, if they were careful, if they were willing to become what the plan required. Robert looked at each of his sons in turn. I'm not ordering you to do this. You're grown men. You can walk away. But I'm doing it, with you or without you. Vincent is my son. That means something to me. It has to mean something. James closed his eyes, wrestling with himself. He thought about his daughters, about LaShonda, about the life he'd built, despite Detroit's collapse. A modest life, but honest, clean. He thought about Vincent in that hospital bed, machines breathing for him, his future uncertain. He thought about the code his father had taught him, the same code his grandfather had taught his father. Protect your own. He opened his eyes. I'm in. Saturday, November 14th, 1987, 10:45 at night. Temperature 32 degrees, clear sky, no moon. The Marshall family split into two teams. Robert and Michael in Michael's Chevy Blazer, James and Anthony in James's Ford Taurus. They'd removed the license plates from both vehicles earlier that day, replacing them with plates stolen from cars in long-term parking at Detroit Metro Airport. They wore dark clothing, watch caps, gloves. They carried weapons loaded and ready. They'd spent Thursday and Friday confirming locations, verifying patterns, making sure the intelligence Anthony had gathered was current. The first target was Marcus Jerome Turner, 21 years old, the primary attacker in Vincent's beating. Multiple witnesses had identified him specifically, had described how he'd kicked Vincent in the head while Vincent was already unconscious. Marcus lived in a second-floor apartment on Graciette Avenue, above a closed party store. He kept irregular hours, but Anthony's surveillance showed he usually returned home between 11 and midnight on weekends. Robert and Michael parked the Blazer 3 blocks away on a side street, walked through alleys to reach a position across from Marcus's apartment. They carried the Remington 700 rifle, the weapon Robert had used in Vietnam for precision shooting. They found a position in an abandoned house directly across the street, second floor, window already broken out. Robert set up the rifle on a windowsill, using a rolled-up jacket as a rest. Michael watched the street through binoculars Robert had brought. They waited. 11:17. A blue Pontiac Grand Prix pulled up in front of Marcus's building. Marcus got out, alone, carrying a bag from a fast food restaurant. He was laughing at something, his head back, completely unaware. He walked toward the door to his apartment building. Robert sighted through the scope, centering the crosshairs on Marcus's chest. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadied, muscle memory from 2 decades ago taking over. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound enormous in the quiet night but directionless, echoing off buildings. Marcus went down like his strings had been cut. Robert and Michael were moving before his body hit the pavement, out of the abandoned house, through the alley, back to the Blazer. They were 3 blocks away within 90 seconds, driving normal speed, obeying traffic laws, becoming invisible. The second target was Tyrone Anthony Webb, 20 years old. He spent Saturday nights at his girlfriend's apartment on Chalmers Street, usually arriving around 11:30. James and Anthony waited in the Ford Taurus, half a block from the apartment. Anthony had a .38 revolver in his jacket pocket. James had Michael's shotgun across his lap, hidden under a coat. They debated method, decided that close range was riskier, but necessary given the apartment's location. 11:52. Tyrone walked down Chalmers, alone, hands in his pockets against the cold. Anthony got out of the car, walked toward him, casual, just another person on the street. Tyrone noticed him but didn't recognize him, didn't see the threat. Anthony closed the distance to 10 feet, pulled the revolver, fired 3 times center mass. Tyrone fell. Anthony walked back to the Taurus, got in. James drove away, hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles were white. Sunday morning, Detroit police discovered Marcus Turner's body at 11:23 after neighbors finally called about the man lying on the sidewalk for 12 hours. They found Tyrone Webb at 6:47 when his girlfriend came outside and started screaming. By noon, homicide detectives had connected the killings. 2 7 Mile crew members both shot, both within hours of each other. Detective Lieutenant Frank Morrison, who'd worked homicide for 16 years, recognized the pattern immediately. This wasn't random gang violence, this was targeted elimination. He called Captain Williams at the 7th Precinct. "We've got a problem. Someone's hunting the 7 Mile crew." The crew itself figured it out faster than police. By Sunday afternoon, DeAndre Williams had gathered the remaining members at a house on Faircourt. Everyone on high alert, everyone armed. 8 men left from the core group of 10. DeAndre was smart enough to understand that Marcus and Tyrone dying on the same night meant someone knew who they were, where they'd be, and had the skill to execute them. He started making calls, trying to figure out who had the resources and motivation to come after his crew. Rival gangs? Possible, but 7 Mile was small time, not worth a war. Police? No. Cops didn't assassinate people. Family of someone they'd hurt? That seemed most likely. But they'd hurt a lot of people. Sunday evening, the Marshall family struck again. The third target was Kevin Lamar Price, 22 years old, the third man who'd beaten Vincent. Kevin had gone to ground after hearing about Marcus and Tyrone hiding at his aunt's house on the west side. But Anthony's street network found him. Robert and Anthony took this one, just the 2 of them. They found Kevin's aunt's house on Sturdivant Street at 8:30 in the evening. Kevin was in the basement, watching television, thinking he was safe. Robert walked up to the front door and knocked. The aunt answered, a woman in her 50s wearing a church dress. "Help you?" Robert smiled, polite, unthreatening. "I'm looking for Kevin. His mama sent me. Said it was important." The aunt hesitated, then called down to the basement. Kevin came upstairs, suspicious but not alarmed. He didn't know Robert Marshall. Didn't know what Robert's face looked like. Robert shot him in the chest with the .38 revolver. Twice. Close enough to see his eyes widen in recognition that he was dying. The aunt screamed. Robert and Anthony ran to their car and drove away. The 4th and 5th targets came that same night. Lamont Davis, 19 years old, and Jamal Anderson, 23 years old. Both were at a crack house on Faircourt Street, the same house where the crew was meeting. Michael and James handled this. They couldn't get inside without a firefight, so they waited until someone came out. At 11:15, Lamont and Jamal walked to Jamal's car, planning to make a run to a liquor store. Michael was positioned in an alley with the Remington. He shot Lamont first, then Jamal, as he tried to run. Inside the house, the remaining crew members heard the shots, knew what was happening, knew they were being systematically eliminated. DeAndre Williams made a decision. He called everyone he trusted, told them to scatter, to leave Detroit if possible, to go to family in other cities. He packed a bag and disappeared into the night, heading to his cousin's place in Flint, 60 miles north. Monday, November 16th, 1987. Detroit police had 5 murders in 2 days, all 7 Mile crew members, all executed with precision that suggested military or professional training. Lieutenant Morrison assembled a task force, pulled in detectives from multiple precincts, started working connections and informants. But the street was silent. Nobody was talking. Even people who hated the 7 Mile crew weren't willing to be witnesses to what was clearly a war they wanted no part of. The remaining crew members were in hiding. Chris Thompson, 24 years old, had fled to his grandmother's house in River Rouge. Raymond Jackson, 21 years old, was hiding in an abandoned building on the east side, too scared to go home. DeAndre Williams was in Flint. 2 others, whose names Anthony had on his list, had left the state entirely, taking Greyhound buses to family in Ohio and Indiana. That left 5 targets in the Detroit area. The Marshall family had one more night. Robert called a meeting Monday afternoon at his house. Vincent remained in a coma, stable but unresponsive. The doctors said brain swelling was decreasing, a positive sign, but they couldn't predict when or if he'd wake. Dorothy had stopped arguing with her husband, and sons had retreated into a kind of silent horror, going through motions of daily life while understanding that her family was dissolving around her. Robert spread Anthony's map on the kitchen table. 5 left. We finished tonight. All of us together. Michael nodded. Anthony studied the map, marking locations. James looked sick, but determined. They divided into pairs again. Robert and James would take Chris Thompson in River Rouge. Michael and Anthony would handle Raymond Jackson and the 2 others if they could be found. DeAndre Williams in Flint was too far, too risky, but Anthony had connections working on finding him. 10:35 that night, Robert and James found Chris Thompson at his grandmother's house on Polk Street in River Rouge, a small city just south of Detroit. The house was dark except for one light in a second-floor bedroom. They knocked on the door. Chris's grandmother answered, a woman in her 70s, using a walker. "Help you?" Robert showed her a fake badge he'd made, a piece of cardboard with a gold star sticker. "Detroit Police, ma'am. We need to speak with Chris Thompson. It's about the murders." The grandmother let them in, trusting that police were safe, that police were here to protect her grandson. She called Chris downstairs. He came wearing pajama pants and a t-shirt, not expecting trouble in his grandmother's house. Robert shot him in the chest with the revolver. The grandmother screamed, collapsed. James caught her before she hit the floor, eased her into a chair, then ran with his father out of the house. Raymond Jackson was harder. He was moving between abandoned buildings, paranoid, armed. Michael and Anthony tracked him to a burned-out house on Mont Elliott Street at 12:40 in the morning. Anthony went in first, flashlight in one hand, revolver in the other. He found Raymond on the second floor, sleeping on a mattress surrounded by crack vials and fast food wrappers. Anthony didn't hesitate, didn't announce himself. He shot Raymond 3 times. The 2 remaining targets, Marcus's cousin Leon and Tyrone's friend Dwayne, were found together at an apartment on Harper Avenue. Michael took both of them with the shotgun at 2:15 in the morning. Tuesday, November 17th, 1987. 8 murders in one night. 10 total in 3 days. Detroit police were overwhelmed. Lieutenant Morrison stood in the Situation Room at headquarters downtown, looking at crime scene photos, ballistics reports, witness statements that said nothing useful. The murders were spread across the entire East Side and into River Rouge. Different weapons, different methods. But the victims were all 7 Mile crew, all executed with purpose. Morrison knew this wasn't random. Someone had systematically eliminated an entire gang's leadership. The question was who and why. He started pulling files, looking for recent victims of 7 Mile crew violence. Beatings, robberies, assaults. There were dozens. Narrowing it to serious violence in the past month, he found 6 possibilities. One was Vincent Marshall, beaten outside the Quick Stop Market on November 8th, currently in a coma at Detroit Receiving Hospital. Morrison drove to the hospital Tuesday afternoon, spoke with Vincent's doctor, got the family's contact information. He found Dorothy Marshall in the ICU waiting room. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, like someone who hadn't slept in days. Morrison introduced himself gently. "Mrs. Marshall, I'm investigating the murders of several young men who may be connected to your son's assault. I need to speak with your family." Dorothy looked at him with eyes that held nothing. "My husband and sons are at work. I can give you their numbers." Morrison took the information, thanked her, left. Something in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. He just needed evidence. That evidence came Wednesday afternoon. A witness who'd been at the Quick Stop when Vincent was beaten finally came forward, a woman named Sandra Phillips who'd watched the whole thing, who'd felt guilty for days. She identified Marcus Turner, Tyrone Webb, and Kevin Price as the attackers. She also mentioned that she'd seen a Chevy Blazer pull up during the beating, a man getting out, and recognized him as one of the Marshall brothers from the neighborhood. Morrison pulled vehicle registrations for the Marshall family. Michael Marshall owned a Chevy Blazer. James Marshall owned a Ford Taurus. Morrison requested a search warrant. Thursday, November 19th, at 6 in the morning, Detroit police executed simultaneous raids on 4 addresses: Robert and Dorothy's house on Mack Avenue, Michael's apartment, James's rental house, Anthony's room at a boarding house on Gratiot. They found weapons, ammunition, clothing that matched witness descriptions. They arrested all 4 Marshall men. Robert, Michael, James, and Anthony were taken to headquarters, separated, interrogated. Robert confessed immediately. Didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't deny anything. "They beat my son, left him for dead. I did what any father would do." Michael, James, and Anthony remained silent, invoked their Fifth Amendment rights, refused to answer questions. But Robert's confession was enough. Evidence connected them to the crime scenes. Ballistics matched weapons found in their possession to bullets recovered from bodies. Witnesses placed their vehicles near multiple murder scenes. The Wayne County Prosecutor's Office charged all 4 Marshall men with 10 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and felony firearm violations. The case was assigned to Judge Patricia Coleman, an African-American woman who'd grown up on Detroit's West Side, who understood the streets but believed in law. The trial began on March 7, 1988, in the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice downtown. The prosecution was led by Assistant Prosecutor David Chen, a Harvard-educated attorney who'd built his reputation prosecuting gang violence. The defense was a patchwork of court-appointed lawyers who were competent but overworked and underfunded. Robert Marshall, against his attorney's advice, pled guilty to all 10 counts of murder during arraignment. He stood before Judge Coleman and said, "I killed those men. I planned it. I executed it. My sons helped because I asked them to. But the decision was mine. The responsibility is mine." The prosecution accepted his guilty plea, but still proceeded with trials for James, Michael, and Anthony Marshall, arguing that all 4 men had participated in a conspiracy, that each had killed or assisted in killing multiple victims. The evidence was substantial. Ballistics reports showing that weapons recovered from the Marshall home matched bullets from 6 of the 10 victims. Witness testimony placing Marshall family vehicles near crime scenes. Sandra Phillips identifying Michael Marshall as the man who'd found Vincent after the beating, establishing motive. Cell phone records showing calls between family members in the days leading up to the murders. The defense argued self-defense of family, extreme emotional disturbance, systemic failure of law enforcement to protect Vincent Marshall. They called witnesses who testified about 7 Mile crew violence, about police indifference to crime on the East Side, about the code that governed streets where legal justice was theoretical. They put Dorothy Marshall on the stand, and she wept, describing Vincent's injuries, the doctors saying he might never wake, the helplessness of watching her baby son on machines. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Media coverage was intense, split along racial lines. White suburban newspapers portrayed the Marshalls as cold-blooded killers who'd executed 10 young men. Black community newspapers portrayed them as fathers and brothers, pushed to extremes by a system that didn't value black lives, that let gang members beat a college student and face no consequences. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse daily, some demanding maximum sentences, others demanding acquittal. On April 22, 1988, the jury deliberated for 11 hours before returning verdicts. James Marshall, guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, felony firearm. Michael Marshall, guilty on 9 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, felony firearm. Anthony Marshall, guilty on 7 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, felony firearm. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Coleman addressed the Marshall family directly before imposing sentences. "You took the law into your own hands. You became judge, jury, and executioner for 10 human beings, regardless of what those victims did. Regardless of how the system failed your family, murder is murder. This court cannot condone vigilante justice." Robert Marshall received 10 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. James Marshall received 40 years to life. Michael Marshall received life without parole. Anthony Marshall received 35 years to life. All 4 men were remanded immediately to Michigan Department of Corrections. They were processed, separated, sent to different facilities across the state. Robert to Marquette Branch Prison in the Upper Peninsula, the furthest point from Detroit. Michael to Kinross Correctional Facility. James to Muskegon Correctional. Anthony to Ionia Maximum. Dorothy Marshall sat in the courtroom gallery and watched her husband and 3 of her sons led away in chains. She was 50 years old, alone, with a 4th son still in a coma, and 2 granddaughters who would grow up visiting their father behind glass. LaShonda filed for divorce from James 3 months later, not out of anger but out of necessity, needing to move forward for her daughters. Vincent Marshall woke from his coma on November 21st, 1987, 10 days after the beatings that had triggered everything, 3 days after his father and brothers were arrested. He had permanent brain damage, memory problems, seizures that would plague him the rest of his life. When he was told what his family had done, he stopped speaking for 6 weeks. Were the Marshall men murderers? Yes, by every legal and moral definition. They planned and executed the deaths of 10 human beings with premeditation and calculation. They hunted their targets across multiple days, used military tactics, showed no mercy. Marcus Turner was shot in the chest while holding a bag of fast food, never had a chance to defend himself or surrender. Tyrone Webb was executed on a public street. Kevin Price was killed in front of his aunt. Chris Thompson was shot in his grandmother's house. Raymond Jackson was shot while sleeping. These weren't combat situations or self-defense scenarios. These were assassinations, pure and simple. The Marshall family became exactly what they were fighting against. People who used violence to solve problems, who valued their own code over human life, who decided that their pain justified ending others' existence. Were they desperate fathers and brothers trying to protect family in a system that had completely failed them? Also, yes, and that's the uncomfortable truth that makes this story more than a simple crime narrative. Vincent Marshall was beaten nearly to death on a public street in front of 40 witnesses, and nobody helped. Nobody called police until Michael arrived. Nobody testified when detectives investigated. The Quick Stop Market owner watched through bulletproof glass and did nothing. The 7 Mile crew operated openly, selling crack on corners, beating people who disrespected them, and faced minimal law enforcement pressure because the 7th Precinct was understaffed and overwhelmed. When the Marshall family reported Vincent's assault, filing a police report with names of attackers and witness accounts, the response was a detective taking notes and saying he'd look into it, knowing he wouldn't, knowing the witnesses would never testify, knowing the prosecutor wouldn't touch a case, with no cooperation. The legal system offered the Marshall family exactly nothing. No justice, no protection, no recognition that Vincent's life and safety mattered. Robert Marshall had spent 26 years working in auto plants that closed and moved to Mexico, paying taxes to a city that couldn't keep streetlights working, following laws that didn't protect his children. Detroit Police Chief William Hart, who retired in 2003 after 34 years of service, gave an interview in 2015 about the Marshall case. The system failed Vincent Marshall before his family ever killed anyone. We knew 7 Mile crew was out there. We knew they were violent, but we had 300 officers to cover the entire East Side, murders happening every night, crack epidemic exploding, no resources, no support. When Robert Marshall came looking for justice, we had nothing to offer him. I'm not saying what he did was right, but I understand why he did it, and that's the tragedy. Good men became killers because we couldn't protect their families. The Marshall case exposed every failure in Detroit's criminal justice system. Police couldn't or wouldn't investigate street-level violence. Witnesses wouldn't testify because they knew gang retaliation was real and police protection was fantasy. Prosecutors wouldn't bring cases without witnesses. Judges couldn't impose meaningful sentences, even when convictions happened because prisons were overcrowded and parole was automatic. The cycle was perfect and completely broken. Violence happened. Nobody was held accountable. More violence happened in response. But acknowledging system failure doesn't excuse murder. 10 young men died, most of them barely adults, most of them products of the same failed system that created the Marshall's desperation. DeAndre Williams was 23 years old with intelligence that could have made him successful in any legitimate field if opportunity had existed. Marcus Turner was 21, Tyrone Webb was 20. They made terrible choices, engaged in violence and drug dealing, but they were also kids shaped by poverty and hopelessness and a society that had written them off before they hit puberty. 37 years have passed since that November in Detroit, when the Marshall family hunted 10 gang members across 3 nights and changed nothing except the trajectories of their own lives. Detroit has evolved, adapted, found new ways to struggle. The population continues to decline, now under 700,000, less than half what it was in 1950. The East Side still bears scars from the crack epidemic, still has blocks of abandoned houses, still has corners where young men sell drugs and violence solves disputes. 7 Mile Road looks different now. Some stretches gentrified with coffee shops and art galleries. Others still abandoned and dangerous. The Quick Stop Market, where Vincent Marshall was beaten, closed in 1993. The building was demolished in 2002. Today it's an empty lot with grass growing through cracked pavement, completely unmarked, except by people old enough to remember. Robert Marshall died in prison on July 8, 2019, at age 84, having served 31 years at Marquette Branch Prison. He died of lung cancer, the same disease that killed so many auto workers who'd breathed asbestos and chemical fumes for decades. His body was returned to Detroit and buried at Elmwood Cemetery next to his grandfather, Elijah. Dorothy attended the funeral, age 82 by then, still living in the house on Mack Avenue, still visiting her remaining incarcerated sons every month. James Marshall was released on parole in October 2015 after serving 27 years. He was 58 years old. His daughters grown with children of their own who barely knew him. He works at a youth center on Detroit's west side, talking to teenagers about choices and consequences, about how violence solves nothing, about how prison steals your life in ways you can't imagine until you've lived it. His voice carries weight because he's lived what he's talking about. Kids listen to him because he doesn't preach, doesn't judge, just tells truth. Michael Marshall remains incarcerated at Kinross Correctional Facility, serving life without parole. He's 65 years old now, his hair gray, his body broken from decades of prison routine. He's been stabbed twice in prison fights, has diabetes, walks with a cane. His release date is never. He'll die inside those walls probably within the next 10 years. Another casualty of decisions made in rage and desperation during 3 nights in 1987. Anthony Marshall was released in March 2018 after serving 30 years. He was 55 years old, had entered prison at 25, had spent more than half his life inside. He left Michigan immediately, moved to Atlanta where he has a cousin, works in a warehouse, lives quietly. He doesn't talk about what happened, doesn't grant interviews, just tries to finish out whatever years he has left in peace. Vincent Marshall is 56 years old, living in a subsidized apartment in Westland, a suburb west of Detroit. He never finished college, never married, works part-time at a library shelving books, a job that doesn't require complex thinking or stress his damaged brain. He has seizures monthly, memory problems, difficulty with emotional regulation. The beating destroyed his future, and his family's response destroyed any chance of rebuilding. Dorothy Marshall is 87 years old, still living in the house on Mack Avenue, despite everyone telling her to move somewhere safer. The neighborhood has deteriorated further. She's one of 3 occupied houses on her block, but she refuses to leave because this house is all she has left of the family that once filled it with noise and life and hope. She visits James every Sunday, writes letters to Michael and Anthony, tends Robert's grave monthly. She never remarried, never recovered from watching her family disintegrate. The Marshall house will likely be demolished within 5 years after Dorothy dies. The city owns most of the surrounding properties, has plans for redevelopment that may never happen. And then the last physical evidence of the Marshall family will be gone, erased like so many Detroit stories that nobody bothered to preserve. There's no memorial to the 10 7 Mile crew members who died. No plaque, no marker, nothing. Their families scattered, some leaving Detroit entirely, trying to escape the weight of what happened. The crew itself dissolved immediately after the murders. DeAndre Williams, who'd fled to Flint, was arrested 6 months later on federal drug charges, served 15 years, got out in 2003, and died of a heart attack in 2011, age 47. But if you drive through Detroit's east side on a November night when the temperature drops to 35 degrees and streetlights flicker because the city can't afford to maintain infrastructure, you might feel something. Not ghosts, nothing supernatural, just the weight of accumulated choices, of systems that failed, of codes that demanded blood, of families destroyed on both sides of violence that solved nothing. The Marshall case didn't change Detroit's gang problem. The 7 Mile crew was replaced by other crews within months. The cycle of violence continued, still continues today, because the underlying conditions, poverty, hopelessness, system failure, never changed. Revenge doesn't heal wounds. It doesn't restore what was stolen or bring back what was lost. It only creates new wounds, new families learning to live with emptiness where love used to be. Robert Marshall protected his family's honor, and in doing so ensured that his family would be scattered, imprisoned, broken. He eliminated 10 threats and created a legacy of pain that will echo through generations. His great-grandchildren, James's grandchildren, carry the weight of a story they barely understand, knowing only that their great-grandfather killed 10 people and died in prison. In the end, only one question remains, one each person must answer for themselves. At what point does protecting what we love transform us into the very thing we're fighting against? If this story made you think about justice, legacy, and the price we pay when systems fail and desperation takes hold, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about honor and violence, about how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary darkness when pushed to the edge. Comment below. Where do you draw the line between protecting your family and destroying it in the process? What would you have done in Robert Marshall's position? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now somewhere, with different people facing the same impossible choices in forgotten corners where the system has failed and desperation takes hold. The names change, the circumstances evolve, but the fundamental question remains: what are we willing to become to protect what we love? Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made, one broken system, one desperate decision, one act of violence at a time. And the line between justice and vengeance isn't drawn in law books or courtrooms. It's drawn in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from.